morning, everybody. Welcome. We'll just give it another couple of seconds to see if more people are joining us this morning. And good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Kavita, and I am the clinical research co-lead for the Trauma and Recovery Research Unit. We are a team of researchers at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences here at McMaster University. We are led by Dr. Margaret McKinnon, who is a clinical neuropsychologist and a leading expert in trauma research. She, along with our other panelists, will introduce themselves later on. At the Trauma and Recovery Research Unit, our work focuses on understanding trauma and how it impacts people, and on developing and testing programs to help support people who are affected by trauma or are experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And post-traumatic stress is sort of an umbrella term that we use to refer to the various mental health impacts of being exposed to traumatic events or of experiencing traumatic events. You've probably heard of the term PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a clinically diagnosed mental health disorder that can occur after being exposed to or after experiencing traumatic events. You may have also heard the term PTSI, which stands for post-traumatic stress injury. And PTSI is not so much a formal clinical diagnosis. It's more a way to acknowledge that the psychological or mental impact of trauma is an injury. On the plus side, being an injury, it is temporary, it is treatable. Symptoms of post-traumatic stress can include having intrusive or unwanted thoughts and memories, having nightmares related to the traumatic event or events, or having flashbacks, which is where we feel like we're reliving the traumatic event or events that happened. Symptoms can also include things like feeling really irritable, having a short fuse, and hypervigilance, which means being on alert or feeling like we have to be on guard all the time, even when there is no specific threat or danger currently. Symptoms can also include feeling numb, feeling detached or disconnected from ourselves or from others, having no energy or motivation, losing interest in hobbies and activities, and so on. There are two main concepts or theories we use when we're trying to understand trauma and the impacts that trauma can have. The first concept here is the idea that the brain is divided into 3 layers. Now, the brain is a very complex organ, so this is definitely an oversimplification, a very high-level view, but looking at the brain in this way, as having 3 layers, really helps us understand trauma. So bear with me for a few minutes. The first layer, starting at the bottom here, right, and closest to the body, is called the survival brain. It controls the basic functions, the basic mechanisms needed for survival and for safety. Most of the information from our surroundings and from within the body even enters the brain here and is then sent to the upper sections of the brain. And because the main goal of the survival brain is to, well, survive, it reacts really quickly, really instinctively to protect against any possible danger or threat. The second layer, which is the middle section here, is kind of like on the inside, right, is called the emotional learning brain. And that's because it is responsible for emotional learning, storing past memories, and controlling the release of hormones. This region of the brain plays a very important role in how we understand or make sense of our experiences, and also in how we respond to what is happening around us. The survival brain and the emotional learning brain work very closely together. So if I were to come face to face with a tiger, all my immediate and instinctual reactions and responses would be coordinated by the survival brain and the emotional learning brain. My heart would start beating faster, my blood pressure would go up, the muscles in my arms and legs would tense up, would start breathing faster, And since this experience brings up such a strong sense of fear, it will become a long-lasting memory because there's that emotional weight to it. And the emotional learning brain kind of acts like a computer of sorts, right? It tags these really intense experiences with emotional weight so that they're stored for in the long term. The third layer up here, so the top layer, is the executive brain. It's also called the learning brain, the thinking brain, or the reflective brain. This is, for lack of a better term, the CEO of the brain, right? It's responsible for attention, for problem solving, for decision making, learning new skills, and so on. After we've experienced a trauma, this executive brain or learning brain can become underactive. And the survival brain and emotional brain can take over and become overactive because our survival and safety is the highest priority. This can cause us to feel stuck in a survival mode, right? Where we feel like we are constantly on alert. We feel like we have to be on guard all the time. We may find ourselves jumping at little sounds, little surprises, or going into fight or flight mode really quickly. Our sense of danger becomes really sensitive, right? So it can seem like there's a threat around every corner, even if that is not actually the case. We may also find that we're having really intense, really strong emotional reactions, especially when something reminds us of that traumatic event in some way, whether directly or indirectly. And all of this together can make it really hard to stay calm, to feel balanced, and we may feel like we cannot fully trust ourselves or others. So the second concept we use when we're trying to understand trauma and the impacts of trauma is the window of competence. It's also called the window of tolerance. This is the idea or theory that there is an optimal or ideal zone. Excuse me. And when we're in this zone or within our window of competence, we are able to function really well, emotionally and mentally. We feel calm, we're able to think clearly, we're able to make decisions and manage our emotions, even when things are stressful. Everyone's window looks different, and this window can get narrower or wider with various life experiences. After a trauma, our window of competence can get narrower, and this is the case for a lot of people, which means that it becomes easier for the brain and the body to be pushed outside the window of competence, which means that, when the window is narrower, we can be pushed into a state of hyper arousal, which is up there in the blue. And this would be things like being on high alert, being stuck in fight or flight mode, feeling jumpy, feeling irritable, being unable to sleep, always on edge, and so on. We can also alternatively be pushed into a state of hypoarousal, which is down there. And this would be things like feeling numb, feeling disconnected, feeling detached, feeling unmotivated, going into a freeze mode, like collapse mode, feeling like we're shutting down. And this narrowing of our window of competence makes sense and kind of ties into the fact that our survival brain and emotional learning brain have become overactive, and our learning brain or executive brain or thinking brain has become underactive. So the priorities have shifted, and the brain is working very, very hard to keep us safe and to make sure that we are feeling safe. So programs and strategies to help reduce or lessen the impact of trauma are typically focused on helping people access their executive brain or learning brain or thinking brain and widen their window of tolerance. The way to do this would be to recognize when we are outside the window of competence and then use strategies to bring ourselves back into the window. A fair number of the current treatments for trauma do this using what we call a top-down approach. That is, they start with the executive brain or learning brain. The idea here is to identify those negative or distorted thoughts or beliefs and challenge those negative thoughts and beliefs and change them which can then help us stay within our window of competence for longer periods of time and help us return to the window of competence faster when we are pushed out of it. And these top-down treatment approaches can be very effective, but they may not be as effective in situations where the executive brain or learning brain is not fully engaged in the process, or depending on other things like someone's personality or preferences, what kind of impact trauma has had on their life in the past, how severely trauma is currently impacting their life and their day-to-day functioning, what kinds of traumatic experiences they've had, and so on. So we set out to develop a bottom-up approach. And that is, we wanted to develop an approach to treating trauma or post-traumatic stress that starts with sensory processing. And sensory processing is the ability to notice, organize, and respond to the different pieces of information or the different signals that we receive from our environment, whether that's external or internal. So we perceive, which is the first kind of part of it, we perceive or we become aware of information or signals or input that are coming in from our external senses, like, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and so on, as well as information, signals, or input coming from our internal senses. So this would be pain, temperature, our sense of body position, and so on, right? Then we integrate or we make sense of all of these different types of information coming in. When our sensory perception and integration are working well together, we're able to understand what's happening around us and inside of us, and that allows us to react and respond in a suitable way. It also gives us a sense of self, right? How we perceive sensory information depends a lot on something that we call the neurological threshold, which is the amount of sensory input required for us to notice the sensory input. So on one end of the spectrum, which is down here, are people who have a low threshold, which means they only need a little bit of sensory input, right? So it's like having a small cup, only a little amount of water would be needed to fill the cup. Other people on the other end of the spectrum there have a high threshold, which means they need more sensory input. They have a bigger cup, so the amount of water needed to fill it would have to be larger. We also react and respond to sensory input differently. Some people are more passive, which means that they wait for the sensory input to come in before they react or respond. Other people are active, which means that they will either go looking for sensory input or actively take steps to avoid sensory input. People who have a high threshold and don't seek out sensory experiences or don't take steps to avoid sensory experiences would fall into a pattern of sensory processing called low registration, which is in that green circle up there. For anybody in the audience that does struggle with color vision deficiency or color blindness, this is the top left corner in that quadrant that's currently on the screen. People who have a low threshold or a small cup and don't seek out sensory experiences or avoid sensory experiences would fall into a pattern called sensory sensitivity. This is on the bottom left there on the quadrant in the yellow circle. In the sensation-seeking pattern, which is the top right of the quadrant in the blue circle, are the people who have a high threshold and look for more sensory input. Finally, people who have a low threshold and take steps to avoid sensory input that feels uncomfortable or overwhelming fall into the sensation avoiding pattern, which is in the bottom right in the purple circle. So as you can tell, sensory processing plays a big role in developing important skills in movement, in behavior, in thinking, and so on. So being able to manage sensory information and respond to sensory information is really important for functioning well in everyday life. After experiencing a trauma, our ability to process sensory information can become dysregulated, meaning our responses can become heightened or uneven. And when we come across a reminder of the trauma or a trigger, our perception of our bodily sensations and our perception of the sensory input might become distorted, which makes it even harder for us to manage sensory input, which can lead to feeling like we're out of control or feeling like we don't have control. And that is really, really hard. We developed the Sensory Strategies Education for Post-Traumatic Stress Injury program, or SENSE-PTSI, as a bottom-up approach that starts with sensory processing. This project, from development to testing, was made possible thanks to the generosity of Veterans Affairs Canada. Our goal was to help people increase their bodily awareness and feel more connected to their surroundings, which would then make it easier and quicker for them to recognize when they are outside their window of competence. We also wanted to teach people how to use sensory-based strategies and sensory tools to help them expand the different kinds of sensations that they are able to tolerate, which in turn would slowly widen their window of competence and help them bring themselves back into the window quicker when they are pushed outside of it. As clinicians and scientists, we wanted to make sure to create an accessible program so that people are able to attend sessions even if they don't live within driving distance or don't have easy access to transportation or have disabilities or medical conditions that may make it difficult for them to attend in person. We designed SENSE-PTSI to be delivered virtually or online. We also designed the program to be group-based because we know that social support and peer support can play a really important role in trauma recovery. We implemented a semi-structured format for the group sessions. The first half of each session focuses on providing information about a specific topic or a specific subject related to post-traumatic stress with interactive discussions. And the second half of the session focuses on learning and practicing sensory-based strategies and on using sensory tools. So each participant received a package or a box in the mail containing a professionally designed participant manual and a selection of sensory tools like essential oils, worry stones, a big stress ball, a soft fleece blanket, a pack of really strong mint, and so on. The manual provided an overview of the content that would be covered in each session and detailed explanations of the sensory strategies that were being introduced in each session. It also had tracking logs so that participants could track which sensory strategies and sensory tools they tried out on their own during sessions or in between sessions and write down or track what worked for them, what didn't work for them, and so on, if they chose to. We decided to structure the SENSE program into 5 modules delivered over 5 weekly sessions. Each weekly session, like I said before, would begin with evidence-based information on a specific topic related to post-traumatic stress and its impacts. Then, after a short break, the second half of each weekly session would involve learning and practicing 2 new sensory-based strategies and interactive discussions on how to incorporate sensory tools into the strategies being introduced that week, how to practice these at home, how they may be modified depending on each person's individual preferences. For example, in the first half of session 2, the information provided covers what sensory regulation is, how sensory regulation can impact the brain, the mind, and body, and how it can be helpful for post-traumatic stress injury. The second half of session 2 introduces a strategy called Find the Emotion in Your Body, which is a simple exercise that helps strengthen the connection between the mind and the body by allowing us to focus on the physical feeling of the sensation rather than being overwhelmed by thoughts or by outside stress. Because sensory processing is such an important part of this bottom-up approach, we decided to use a measure called the Adolescent Adult Sensory Profile, or the AASP. So this measure would allow us to let participants know what their individual sensory profile was, or what their specific patterns and preferences looked like, so that they could keep this information in mind as they were incorporating the sensory tools or sensory strategies into their daily lives. So for example, someone with a high score in the sensory sensitivity quadrant, so that would be someone whose cup is small and does not actively look for sensory experiences or does not actively avoid sensory experiences, could potentially benefit from deep pressure touch, such as deeply massaging the palm of one hand with the other thumb while watching TV. Right? Once we developed the program, we needed to test it. And because this was the first time the program was being trialed, our main goal was to do a research study to find out whether this program is feasible. That is, we wanted to test it out with a small group of people first to look at things like recruitment, or how many people could we recruit? Were our current methods enough? Or would we need to try to find more ways to find enough participants for a bigger study in the future? Things like that. Collecting data and the tests and instruments we used to look at whether the program helped people. So here we were looking for things like how much time did it take to complete each appointment and each task? Was delivering the program online challenging? We were looking for any unexpected problems that people faced when participating virtually or online. We also wanted to look at things like resources and implementation of the program. So could the research staff handle the workload? Would we need more facilitators in the future? Would we need more staff? So on. We also wanted to look at acceptability and suitability. So was this program acceptable and suitable as a potential treatment option for people who are experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress? How many people dropped out? How many sessions did participants attend? Were the study steps too complicated or time-consuming? We wanted to know if participating in the study was too much work for people. And finally, I think the thing that we're all very excited about, or most excited about, we wanted to know what our participants thought about the program and what the initial results from our more clinical assessments and measures showed us. 89 participants enrolled in the study. That is, they signed the consent form and what expressed an interest in participating in the study and were enrolled in the study. Of those, 30 turned out to be ineligible or did not meet our eligibility criteria for a wide range of reasons. 26 of the remaining participants either dropped out or withdrew at various points through the study. And 36 participants completed the study. And you can see that there's a little asterisk by 36, and that's because not all 36 will be included in the final analysis for, again, a variety of reasons. So we had 23 participants who were assigned to the SENSE group here from that 36, which means that they received the 5-week SENSE program. And 13 participants of the 36 were assigned to what we call a control group, which means that they spent that same 5-week period on a wait list for the SENSE program or receiving no treatment or no program for that same 5-week period. All participants in this study were experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So assigning some of them to the SENSE group and others to the control group would allow us to compare results from people who received the 5-week SENSE program to people who did not, which would give us an idea of how effective the SENSE program might be. Our 36 participants were between 22 and 65 years of age. 16 of our participants identified themselves as being veterans or former military, and all of our participants were or are public safety personnel or military veterans. 28 of our participants said that they were currently employed, whether that's full-time, part-time, self-employed, so on. About 80% of our participants were Caucasian or white. And in terms of gender, 50% of our participants were cisgender men and 28% were cisgender women. To help us evaluate whether the SENSE program was suitable and acceptable as a potential treatment option for post-traumatic stress injury, each of our participants completed one-on-one clinical interviews, a series of questionnaires, and a few video game-like cognitive tasks. They did all 3 of these research steps or research tasks at baseline or T1, which is before the SENSE program or 5-week waiting period started. Then they did it again at T2 or immediately after the SENSE program or 5-week waiting period ended. And then they did it again at T3, which is 3 months after the SENSE program ended or the 5-week waiting period ended. What did we find? We'll start with the most promising and most exciting results first, the severity of the trauma symptoms. Actually, let me rephrase that. The results here are stronger than just promising. We saw statistically significant improvements. So on the left side of your screen here is a figure showing you the results from a self-report measure of trauma symptom severity, which means that it shows results from a questionnaire that each participant filled out by themselves at those 3 time points. For participants in the SENSE group, which is in the orange lines there, trauma symptoms noticeably dropped right after the program ended, and that improvement held steady 3 months later. More importantly, right after the program, the SENSE group improved at a significantly faster rate than the control group did. And the control group is represented by that blue line, the blue line up top. It is true that by the 3-month mark or T3, the control group showed a slight reduction in symptoms. However, the sheer size of improvement in the SENSE group was twice as large as that of the control group, which is amazing to see. On the right side of the screen here is a figure showing you the results from the clinical interview on trauma symptom severity. And here we saw almost the exact same pattern in the clinical interviews. So these were clinician administered interviews rather than self-reported or subjective. So this was very exciting. And what we really have here is solid, significant evidence that the SENSE program was substantially effective at reducing the severity of trauma symptoms that were impacting people's lives. So we move on next to cognitive functioning. So here at T2, or in the middle there, immediately after the program ended, we saw a promising trend where the SENSE group's cognitive functioning was improving faster than that of the control group. While the actual numerical changes are fairly modest and didn't quite hit the strict threshold that we would need for statistical significance, partly because our group was such a small group, right? There's a really important thing to note here. The positive trends were seen only in the SENSE group. The control group didn't show even a hint of improvement. So while it's an early signal, it's still a signal pointing in the right direction for the SENSE group only. We're seeing really encouraging pattern, the same encouraging pattern, but emotion regulation or emotion dysregulation as well. While we are looking more at the overall size of the impact rather than the strict statistical significance right now, again, because of the small number of participants, the 2 groups, as you can tell, are actually moving in opposite directions. So the SENSE group is showing a clear downward trend in emotion dysregulation, which means their ability to manage their emotions is getting better. On the flip side, the control group was actually trending slightly upwards, meaning their struggles seem to be getting worse over time. So again, an early signal, but a very clear difference between going through the SENSE program and being in the control group, which is very exciting. So where do we go from here? We collected feedback from all the participants that went through the SENSE program to get a better understanding of what they thought about the program. Did they find the program useful? Could the program be improved in some way? Was there anything that they didn't find useful or interesting? Did they have any suggestions, recommendations, etc.? And our incredible participants delivered. We received some great feedback. Some participants said that they thought the 4th session, where we cover both movement and sleep, could be split into 2 separate sessions. Some pointed out that it would be very helpful to have 1 or 2 check-ins after the last session to keep the momentum going and to help continue practicing strategies at home in their own time. Most participants said that the virtual online sessions were a big plus, but the manual could possibly have more information, like more details about different ways to modify the strategies, other kinds of sensory tools to look for in their surroundings or in their immediate environment, and so on. So essentially, our next steps will involve reviewing all the feedback that we've received from our amazing participants and looking at making some improvements to the program based on that feedback. Right? Then we'll want to test that modified version again with another small sample of people and see how it does there, and then review feedback. And then finally, sometime in the near future, we would want to do a full trial of the program with a much larger group of participants, where we can focus more on looking at how effective the program itself is as a treatment option for post-traumatic stress, rather than just looking at things like feasibility, acceptability, suitability, right? So we would prioritize the effectiveness of the program as a treatment option when we get to that point and we test it with larger groups. So as you can tell, developing and testing a new program as a potential treatment option is a long and repetitive and sometimes frustrating process, but as we know, good science cannot and should not be rushed. And I want to take a moment here to specifically thank each of our amazing research participants, without whom none of this would have been possible. It was a privilege to work with these incredible people who took time out of their busy lives to help us with this really important work, and we are very, very grateful. Before we move on to the Q&A session, if I could make a quick request, we would greatly appreciate any feedback that you may have for us. You can scan the QR code here or visit redcap.link/sense_feedback survey. So I'll leave that up there for a couple of minutes. And now I will invite our panelists to please introduce themselves. If you would like to turn on your cameras, panelists, I can add you here. All right, and I will stop sharing my screen. Great.
I'd like to say firstly, Kavita, thank you for a wonderful presentation and for all your work to bring this symposium together. We're also appreciative.
Thank you, Margaret.
Truly. Hugo, would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Happy to. So in terms of my background, my main specialization is trauma disorders and dissociation specifically, program development, and also developing trauma-informed cultures. Those are my two areas of focus, two largest areas of focus.
Thanks, Hugo. Do you just want to also say where you work, if that's okay?
Of course, as you'll notice here, I am also a trauma services development lead for Homewood Health, an associate over at HRI, and happy to be part of this lab in a number of different projects as well. So good working with and seeing all of you.
So much, Hugo. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Laura, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Dr. Laura Maunder. I was part of the SENSE study as a postdoc in Dr. Margaret McKinnon's lab. So I got the privilege to actually run some of the groups and see firsthand the effect it was having on, the positive effect it was having on our participants. And now I'm actually working with people with severe emotion dysregulation concerns at a comprehensive DBT clinic. So definitely a strong believer in helping people regulate before we can move into more kind of cognitive-based strategies.
Thank you so much. My name is Margaret McKinnon. I'm a professor in the Associate Chair of Research in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster. I also have the privilege of being the Homewood Research Chair in Mental Health and Trauma and the Research Lead for Mental Health and Addictions at St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I really want to echo Kavita's very important words of thanking our research participants. We could not possibly do this work without you, and we're just so grateful for all your contributions to this project. I'd like to ask the audience and really encourage them if you have questions to please post your questions in the Q&A box below. And I'm going to turn to Kavita now, if she doesn't mind, to start reading out the audience questions.
Might help to unmute myself first. Absolutely. So we have a question here that I will click on answer live. Will any future studies compare the SENSE treatment to other evidence-based treatment options? And Margaret, if you would like to answer that, maybe?
Yeah, that is absolutely the intention to do that. There's different ways of comparing a new treatment to an existing treatment. So one is, does that treatment perform as well as an existing treatment, but have benefits over that treatment? So, for example, it can be delivered online. It has fewer side effects as compared to medications, for example. There's a variety of ways of looking at. You can also look and see if that treatment actually outperforms existing treatments and does better. So those are the sort of questions that we want to ask going forward with Sense. But just remembering that it's not only sort of, how effective that treatment is, it's also the side effect profile and the benefits for patients in terms of how it's delivered as well. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Margaret. So we have another question here from Sophie, who asks, I don't know if you have published these results yet. I was looking into this research a few weeks ago and didn't find anything.
I can comment on that. I'm sorry, I can comment on that as well. So we do have a protocol paper under reviews, which describes Sense, and that's under review right now at a journal. We're writing up the results now as well. So we really wanted to, we really believe in our lab and knowledge translation. So bringing knowledge out to the community rather than it sitting behind academic walls. And we just wanted people to be aware of this treatment and the work that we're doing. So thank you so much again for the question.
Thank you, Margaret. Sophie also wants to know if there were any common features for people who dropped out, and how did you decide what sensory process skills and tasks to include? So if we want to answer the second question first about sensory process and skills and tasks, and then we can go over the common features of people who dropped out, if that's okay.
Dr. Stuckey or Dr. Munder, would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment about the sensory skills. So there in the second half of session, there were always predetermined, kind of manualized kind of grounding strategies that we taught people and participants. So that could be things like progressive muscle relaxation, other kind of mindfulness meditation techniques. And then every participant received a box of sensory regulation tools. So we would pick one or two tools at the end of each session and give them some time to try them in session. So it was pretty standardized, what kind of more mindfulness meditation grounding strategies we were using and what sensory regulation tools we were using each session.
Okay, would you like to comment as well? Oh, we're so sorry, Vika, you're on mute. Sorry about that.
Thank you for letting me know. My apologies for that. Yeah, so happy to. So after Margaret invited me to be part of this, for which I was grateful. It's a great thing to be being built. I think we need more bottom-up kind of approaches. I brought in some pieces that I knew from experience and research did work well in terms of grounding techniques, right, and stabilization techniques. So bringing in kind of evidence-informed, evidence-supported grounding and I would say emotion regulation focused techniques is how we followed that other piece there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note too that we titrated these for trauma. So, for example, when we use mindfulness as part of the program, we use a trauma-informed approach, recognizing that for people who have experienced trauma, it can often be difficult to be present in their bodies or to be aware of their bodies. And we really made sure that these mindfulness exercises were appropriate for trauma. With respect to the sensory toolkit that Kavita was talking about earlier, that was actually quite a long process. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what those tools would be. On our team, we had physiotherapy, nursing, occupational therapy, psychology, And a number of those folks have actually done some sensory regulation work in different settings, including in long-term care. And just thinking about what were some of the tools that they had seen previously to be effective, but also as Kavita raised and others in the group, and Christina Kreisler was also attending, we want to make sure these tools could be used in everyday life, right? So oftentimes, sensory regulation strategies may rely upon complex equipment or things that we can't bring to our everyday lives. And that's perfectly fine and really important. But we also wanted tools that people might be comfortable using at work, that they might be comfortable, taking in the car with them, whatever it may be, portable, and also things that they would feel comfortable with in those other settings. So there are other sensory regulation approaches, and we actually think of them as perhaps stage two. So stage one, I think, is partially establishing safety and skills and also educational learning for individuals who have experienced post-traumatic stress injuries. These other sort of downstream, I would say, sensory regulation strategies may be a different approach that could be contemplated later on in treatment. Not, we don't have evidence for that, so I'm just speculating, but that's my clinical opinion surrounding that. And the other question was around dropouts. And Kavita, I wonder if you wanted to comment on that or anyone else who's here.
Absolutely. So we are still reviewing all of those kinds of factors and looking at why people dropped out. But the trend seems to be that life happens,
Mm.
um, work work schedules changed. As I mentioned, a lot of our participants were public safety personnel, first responders, military veterans, and a lot of our participants were shift workers or had kind of rotating schedules, schedules that wouldn't necessarily align with being able to join a 2-hour virtual session once a week, every week for 5 weeks consistently. And there were people that dropped out because of that. That seemed to be the general trend. And there were a few that dropped out because, before the study even started, because they realized that this was not necessarily going to work for them given their schedule. And again, one of the things that we would look at incorporating some point in the future would be to potentially think of asynchronous delivery of some of these programs and see how it could be made more accessible for people who do have, a lot of variability in their schedules and are unable to attend sort of live, so to speak. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Kavita. And I think we have a real commitment in our group to thinking about rural and remote communities. So delivery of treatments that can reach people who are living in regions where they may not have access to mental health care in the same way that folks living in urban areas might. And so I think that online delivery has been a really important component of the work that we're doing because unfortunately, in our province of Ontario and other provinces across Canada and territories, there's often a lack of access to mental health care, and that is a really important principle to us in our group. Kavita, are there additional questions in the Q&A?
Absolutely. So we have a question here from Richard Bennett. If you extended each session in depth, topic, and skill sessions, would you imagine the results being even greater? As a participant, that was one of my feedback suggestions. Very happy to have been able to participate and learn these valuable skills in education. Thank you, Richard. Margaret, Laura, Huga, would one of you like to comment or answer this?
Laura and Huga, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I definitely have some hypotheses. So I think, yes, probably we would see maybe even greater results. And again, I'm thinking of like kind of balancing, people's time with, how much time we can extend a session for. So I'm just thinking about there was a study that was done at St. Joseph's Healthcare Hamilton, the hospital that's kind of affiliated with McMaster, where the study was done. And they've some psychiatry residents, and they wanted to know like what causes people to miss sessions, like what causes people to miss online virtual sessions. And what they found is that it's actually people like to tend to be in their like 30s, 40s who are like have very busy lives, might have like dependents in the home and like tend to be working. So or more fuller time. So I think there's kind of this balance of if we did extend sessions to be a bit longer and include more depth, that probably would be more helpful, and we'd probably lose some people that, you know, are trying to make the time in their week to come. So something to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the principles of trauma treatment that I found very, very helpful is the slower you go, the faster you get there and the farther you go,
I love that
right?
thing.
So I think if we were to expand, I think we would expand over time rather than length of session. I think, I think this is as a first run was an attempt of how do we get enough meaningful content in a short enough period of time that people won't, right? When people trying something out for the first time, they're willing to take that risk,
Yeah.
right? So 5 sessions feels like a manageable commitment. I think, with promise, what we probably would do is expand the length of the program as opposed to length of the sessions. Um, and just to note that, grounding skills are regulation skills. So that we're actually doing two things at once. And if you look at kind of how change happens over time, you see PTSD symptoms go down, then you see emotional regulation symptoms go down, and then you see dissociation go down, right? So I think in terms of the findings too, we would probably find more robust findings to the underlying question if we did a longer period of time with more content and more time to practice. Because I think that it's really is, we emphasize this throughout the program. Um, it's the practice that makes the progress, right? So it's really taking that time and investing the time. You're taking the healthy risk to do the program, really then getting the most benefit out of it by practicing as much as you can, right? Starting with the ones that speak to you immediately and then expanding from there. I think that would in fact result both right, if we could track practice, I think we would find in separate research I've been part of, we've found that practice increased outcomes. So there's research to support that. So I think we'd find that here, but also just length and time with the skills. I think you're right. I think we would find better effect.
I was thinking also about the SMART program, which was developed by Elizabeth Warner, initially for children
Yep.
with emotional dysregulation and who have experienced trauma. And I think that program really, as I was mentioning, like I contemplated as sort of a second phase after this, but again, that needs to be tested. But really, they had take the opportunity to use sensory regulation to process traumatic memories as well with a skilled therapist. And I think that may be a next step potentially in treatment as well. So I know that there are trials going on at the University of Western Ontario with Dr. Ruth Lanius looking at that. So I think, really interesting questions out there surrounding these approaches. And thank you for the question, Richard, and thank you for the recommendation, because it's something we really do need to think about as we move forward with developing this intervention.
Okay, we have another question here from Nemia. I'm sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly. When you were conducting a test, did you use hospital patients, students, or members of the community? This is a great question, and one that we get often, I think. In this particular research study, it was military veterans and public safety personnel. And so people who had been exposed to traumatizing events through the course of their occupation and were currently experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress as a result. So as per these three categories, this would be members of the community.
Yeah, and it's a really, thank you, Kavita. And I think it's really important for us at this point too to thank our sponsor, Veterans Affairs Canada, who so generously provided the funding for us to develop this treatment intervention and also to trial it through the study that we've been talking about. So we just really are grateful to VAC for their support of this through the Veterans Wellbeing Fund.
Here's another question from Sophie. How do you feel this ties into physical/emotional avoidance of intimacy in post-traumatic stress injury?
We have a real expert in this topic, Laura, Dr. Monder. Would you like to comment on that, Laura?
Sorry, can you just repeat, Kavita, can you just repeat the question?
Yes. The question is, how do you feel that this program or the the premise of the program, ties into physical / emotional avoidance of intimacy in post-traumatic stress injuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually, as part of my postdoc in Dr. Margaret McKinnon's lab, I got to do some research on the effect of military sexual trauma on the partners of people who had been affected by military sexual trauma. And it was a qualitative study, and what we found was that, yeah, it has a huge effect. Trauma has a huge effect on the emotional relationship, on the sexual relationship. And it was really distressing both for the people who had been affected and for their partners as well. So definitely it's something we see in the research. And yeah, I could see that this could be helpful as well. So, participants in that study talked about feeling, just overregulated or just becoming dysregulated when they even thought about becoming intimate with their partner, particularly as it was military sexual trauma. So getting some strategies to kind of regulate first so we can maybe slowly reapproach sexual intimacy or emotional intimacy in a, as Luca's saying, go slow to go fast in a slow way, I think could be helpful for sure. And part of Sense was helping people kind of become more aware of what's going on in their body so that we can recognize when we're maybe getting out of that window of competence before we get out, and then being able to bring ourselves back. And I could see that having big translations to emotional or physical intimacy too, like really being aware of what's going on for us and being able to take a step back if we need to, or use some kind of regulation strategy before we proceed.
Thank you, Laura. Hugo, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think Laura answered that really, really well. I think trying to reapproach something that reminds you of a previous traumatic experience is hard no matter what that content is. So that's going to be especially true with sexual trauma, which is, a very intimate, like sexual relationships are very intimate relationships. And where there's been broken with someone else, it makes sense that similar events would remind you of all of that. So I think they're too very much, the slower they go, you faster you'll get there. Really making sure that there's regulation before starting, right? So the skills taught in Sense can really help someone get into that window of feeling like I've got this, that window of competence, and then moving really, really slowly. And I think, for people who have had sexual trauma, the sexual relationship can be the specific focus of therapy as well, and sometimes of couples therapy. Um, so it is certainly especially complicated when someone's had sexual trauma, for sure.
Thank you both. And
Mhm.
I think that statement, the slower we go, the faster we go, I just find that such an eloquent way of describing approaches to trauma. And I don't know, Hugo, if you'd like to comment on that, or Laura, if you'd like to comment on that. I just think it's a really important principle that we can't emphasize enough in many ways.
Mhm. Yeah, agree. I mean, it speaks to almost everything because I think there's a natural tendency, particularly in Western culture, to go as fast as you can. Like, I want to get this done. I want to get this fixed. I want to get this over with, you know. And yet, what we find is that when people push forward quickly, they're often not actively allowing themselves to engage with the pieces that will actually help them.
Yeah.
So, this is a different approach than cognitive approaches. But say, for example, in cognitive approaches, if you're using worksheets and you're just pushing your way through them and not really staying connected and grounded, so that means disconnected from your own emotions, the work you're doing won't actually help you, right? So this is why it's so important to be grounded, regulated in your window of competence, right? In that window of I got this, to be able to make that progress. And when we're pushing through without that, it may look like we've done something, but we haven't actually accomplished what the goal of the work was.
Yeah, I think about that in terms of SMART even, so taking the time to process the traumatic memory as well, using sensory regulation skills, right?
Yeah.
Um, Laura, would you like to comment on that as well?
Sure, yeah, I can just add, at the clinic I'm working at now, which, is for people with severe emotion dysregulation concerns. And several of our clients have borderline personality disorder, which is characterized by difficulties with emotion regulation. It's very much the same way. Like, we got to learn these skills and strategies to be able to regulate ourselves before we can even touch the trauma. Because talking about trauma, revisiting trauma, that's dysregulating by definition. So we need to make sure we have skills and tools that I know as a therapist that the client is going to be okay to touch those really, really deeply painful and difficult memories before we jump into it. Yeah, so that's kind of our strategy there.
Thank you both. Peter, do we have more audience questions?
Oh, we do, yes. Romal asked, did you notice any gender-based patterns in terms of participation, dropping out, or responses to the program? Again, excellent question. It's a little hard to say because the number of people that we did have, this was a pilot study, which meant that our sample size or the number of participants was purposefully kept very small. And so with only, anywhere between the 30 to 50 mark or under 50 participants, it's really hard to kind of break it down by gender identity in terms of seeking out patterns. In this case, because 50% or more of our participants were cisgender men, when participating, when dropping out or responding, it seemed like, it does look like it's more men than women. But then again, given that this was the specific occupation that we were looking at and we were recruiting from, that also plays a role in that, I would expect. So I think that if you were to look at it from kind of look at it generally, a high level overview, it probably would even out, I'm guessing. But there wasn't really anything that we could say with certainty that speaks to a pattern. We have a question from Scott Thompson, who asks, how can the participants continue to help move better treatment forward?
Thank you so much for that question. Again, we want to thank our participants, and I think it's really participating in, all kinds of clinical research, right? So, we're not the only group here in Canada who does this work, and I think really research participation, and we cannot emphasize enough how much that really gives back. In some cases, it may provide the opportunity for some healing for individuals who are engaged in new treatments, but also it makes things better for those who come next, right? So I think we always say in our lab, like, research is a form of service, right? It's a way of giving back to others who have had similar experiences. And so we just really want to thank you and thank those of you who participated rather, and really encourage people to continue looking for clinical research to be involved in. It's really important, and it really does make things better, not only potentially for the individuals participating, but also for others who have shared similar experiences. I'm a person with lived experience of PTSD, and I always think, that opportunity to give back is really, I found that very helpful in my own healing, to be really honest. I think it helps to take a very uncontrollable event in your life and maybe give you a sense of control by giving back. And that's not for everyone, obviously, but I think for some people, it could have that benefit. So thank you, Scott, for that question. It's a really good question.
We have a question from Vanessa, who asks, you mentioned that there is some promising change in the cognitive capabilities of the participants in the intervention group or SENSE group. Was there any particular type of cognition that performed better? What do you think the mechanism behind this might be, given that this is a sensory-based intervention? Before we answer that, I just want to point out that the change that we did find was in the participants' self-report of their cognitive functioning in their day-to-day life. So it was their subjective kind of experience where they felt like their difficulties relating to cognitive function had decreased, which means that their cognitive functioning had improved. Given that this was a very, very small group of people, we weren't really able to see that so much on the objective measures of cognition, because again, it's a very, very small sample size. So statistically, we didn't really see much there, but the subjective kind of self-reported cognitive functioning did seem to improve for people in the SENSE group only, and not for people in the control group, which is really, really promising. But I'll let our expert panelists add to that.
I think one way to think about this too is like we'll notice small changes before they show up in more visible ways. And as you've already pointed out, but specifically that when we're more grounded, when we're more in our window of competence, the easier it is for us to think clearly, right? So if I'm feeling emotionally overwhelmed or dysregulated, I don't really have full access to my thinking brain, to my frontal lobes, right? To executive functioning. I'm more in survival brain and emotional brain mode. So what we're doing with these kinds of interventions is helping people get back into a place where they're able to think more clearly through regulating, right? Through helping them go from overwhelmed to I've got this. So that makes a whole lot of sense to me that they would see some improvements there in that way.
And I really appreciate those points. We've been involved in developing treatment approaches for cognitive difficulties in PTSD for many years now, actually. And one thing that we've really observed, I think, is the ability, as Hugo said, to stop and be in the moment. And I would say almost to think about the response before you make it, to slow down, essentially. So we often see in the protocols that we've developed across different protocols, actually, that you see a reduction in what's called inhibition, or you see it increase rather in inhibitory control. So stopping, thinking, and not doing the first thing that sort of comes to mind, or the automatic response. And I think if I had to hypothesize, and it's again completely a hypothesis, I agree with that sort of stopping, slowing down, being present in the moment, and maybe even having the chance to think before engaging in action. Right? We often hear people talk about, for example, road rage. And we use goal management training, which was developed by Baycrest Center in Toronto, which we've modified now for trauma. And it really does, people report, for example, when I'm driving and I become quite enraged, I actually stop and think about what the consequences might be if I were to do something. Or I'm having a conversation with my partner, and the first thought that comes to mind, I recognize it may be quite hurtful. And I'm able to stop myself from making that comment, recognizing what the consequences may be. And I think these therapies converge around that sort of the slower we go, the faster we go, right? Being able to stop and be present in the moment and think and inhibit what our automatic response might be. And again, we don't have that evidence for SENSE at all, aside from knowing people subjectively report cognitive improvements. But I think that's something we'd want to look at down the road for sure. And I just see it as a potentially common mechanism across some of the treatment approaches that we've used.
We have two more questions from Sophie, who asks, thanks for this very interesting presentation. You're welcome, Sophie. I've got two questions. One, I can imagine how people may score high in more than one quadrant, example, sensory seeking and sensory avoiding. Do you have data on how much this happened in your sample? Two, could you provide additional examples of sensory strategies recommended more specifically for individuals in each of the 4 sensory processing quadrants? I can speak to the data part of this question. We, again, being that there were only 36 participants, we don't really have data that could kind of point to anything definitively with, any sort of statistical significance. But, there are theories, that talk about, being in one like scoring high in one particular quadrant can, well, logically speaking, if you were to score high in one particular quadrant, how your trauma kind of presents and impacts your day-to-day functioning would be impacted, because again, it shows your pattern for how you process sensory information that comes in. So as far as the data on that specifically, we haven't quite reached that stage yet. because we're still in, this study just wrapped up very recently. So we're still kind of looking at all of the feasibility questions and the acceptability, suitability questions. But as we kind of, move on to next steps and start incorporating some of that feedback from participants and looking at the data, that is when we would, kind of see where our participants kind of fell in these quadrants and which of the sensory domains fell on those quadrants. Like, was it more tactile? Was it more auditory? So on and so forth. So that's the data piece of it. And Margaret, Laura, Huga, you'd want to comment on the other questions?
I think maybe if we're going to comment on this, to bring up the slide that speaks to the 4 quadrants, so we can kind of
Absolutely, I will do that.
go into a little more depth there, because I think understandably not everyone will follow all the 4 quadrants.
I will just share my screen so that everybody can see that. So this is where we are.
Oh yeah, so I mean, if you think about these 4 different ways of responding to maybe difficult, overwhelming sensation, right? Or difficult experiences, and just a general sense of how people experience the world, right? If you're going to be more sensation seeking, you might like something more intense. So, for example, holding ice, or um, jumping up and down, doing jumping jacks, right? Pushing hard against a chair, right? These kinds of things. If you are sensory sensitive, you might like more subtle things, right? Like holding something that you like the texture of, and it's a soft texture, for example, right? If you're sensation avoiding, then it's really a matter of figuring out what are the sensations that you can tolerate. What are the sensations that, it's kind of like, again, the slower you go, the faster you get there. Like, what's the next manageable, healthy risk you can take towards bringing in more sensation in your life? And so that's where having a menu of different options is really helpful. And then you figuring out what works best for you, because I think that's another core part of this or any other kind of grounding, sensation focused intervention, is making sure you're listening to yourself and paying attention to you, what works for you. Because things that can often work for others may not work for you for exactly these reasons, right? And in terms of low registration, I think that's one where I have less less experience with. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on low registration techniques.
What I would comment on, again, thank you for that really wonderful description, is really, again, that taking the time to experience those sensations, right? So we may touch a soft object, for example, but we need to be aware of that touch and to spend the time feeling it, holding in your hands. You might rub it back and forth in your fingers, and really being aware of that sensation. Because if we don't bring the sort of mindfulness component, in a sense, to this, the strategies may be less effective, right? We often talk about, for example, folks who are feeling emotionally overwhelmed. Imagine or you can rather sit in your chair, press your back up against the chair, feel the sensation of your body sitting in the chair, your feet on the ground. Imagine your feet growing roots into the ground. And that's the way of sort of guiding yourself also through experiencing those sensations as well. So I just really want to emphasize that point, because I think it's a big part of the approach that we've taken here.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I just want to emphasize actually the way you put that was really beautiful, because it's deepening into the experience, right? So for someone with low registration, they have a hard time taking it in. So the more trauma-informed mindfulness, right? Trauma-informed is a really important part there. And one of the things that Dr. Kidder was doing right there, what Mark was doing right there, was an example of that. So yeah, just to emphasize, it's that really that paying attention to that makes so much sense in these kinds of situations.
Mm-hmm.
And interventions or techniques that really encourage that close paying attention to.
Do we have any additional questions from the audience? Rita? Oh, sorry, Kavita, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Yep. Michaela asks, what are your future plans for this program? This sounds like a very valuable program that would be helpful for the population I work with in a women's federal institution.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and so I'll make a couple of comments. Yeah, this was a very preliminary initial study where we really wanted to first, we actually worked for quite some time to develop this protocol, and then we tested it against waitlist control. We do need to do the work in terms of comparing it to more standardized treatments. I mean, I think it's up to clinicians themselves to judge when they feel a treatment is ready for use in patients. Certainly, we were actually talking about the correction setting the other day and thinking about, that would be something where we'd actually like to trial an approach like this. We would love to do that. So that's just a comment I'll make. Yeah.
We have a question from Tracy who asks, how does one become a participant, or how do I get involved as a participant?
Yeah, so we are currently applying for funding for another trial of Sense. So I would really watch our website, watch our social media posts on LinkedIn and other places where you will see recruitment materials. That would be the comment I would make right now. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Thank you for your interest, Michaela. Thank you.
Sophie asks, how does this work look different from research on DBT skills, such as TIP or mindfulness?
Yeah, and I'm going to actually turn to Dr. Monter Lara to comment on that as being an expert in DBT, along with Hugo, who also is.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think with like a lot of therapies, there's a lot of overlap. We turn to other therapies kind of for inspiration and like what can we improve, what can we do different. So there's certainly similarities. So I think the main difference I would say with SENSE is that with DBT, a lot of it is how can we regulate ourselves in the moments when we're feeling super dysregulated, like how can we tolerate that distress? And Sense is a little different in that, yes, it talks about that, but it's also like, how can we in general set up our environment and have things around us that can kind of get our baseline level down where we feel more regulated just in general. So for instance, some of our, tools in our box that we sent to participants were like special lights that we can put up around in our bedroom, for instance, so that we can feel more regulated going to sleep, or a fuzzy blanket that we can use when we're walking around the house. So just kind of almost like a prophylactic in times of like how can we, keep ourselves regulated as much as possible throughout the day. And we can also turn to these tools when we're feeling like we're getting out of that window of competence to bring ourselves back in. I can actually say, oh, sorry, I've actually used these tools. I brought these tools into my DBT clients sometimes of like, how can we, not when we're just at, if we think of like an emotion thermometer, how can we use these tools, not just when we're at 100 out of 100 on our emotion, but how can we use these tools to kind of keep us at that 30, 40% of emotion regulation, or even 20%.
And I was also thinking about, and Laura, that's such a wonderful explanation. Thank you. And I was thinking about also folks who are dissociative. So folks who feel you're not present in the world around them or not present in their body. And so helping to bring that sense of being present in the moment, aware of our surroundings can also be very helpful using these tools as well. And Hugo, maybe you're a wonderful expert in dissociation. Would you like to comment on that further?
Sure. So maybe just tying together both of your comments. So it's here we're both talking about that window of competence again, right? Like helping yourself get and stay in that window, and different kinds of techniques can be helpful there. And again, you're always wanting to pay attention to what works for you. I think if you wanted to like use the language of DBT to speak to what Sense does, it's addressing vulnerability factors proactively, right? There's kind of like a more active approach on looking at vulnerability factors. Not that DBT doesn't, right? Again, lots of similarities in terms of overall aim of helping people, though DBT doesn't use this language, stay in that window of competence. Um, and with paying close attention to your sensory input, that is a big way to help reduce the risk of dissociation, and to be more present in the here and now. And so these kinds of techniques are very common in dissociation treatment. We talk about them mostly as like grounding helpers, right? These different tools, the different ways, like Tangle is one of the things that we included here in part because of experience with dissociative patients. And many folks I know, dissociative and not, that I work with, really find that Tangle very helpful as something to keep the hands busy, right? And stay present and kind of bring things into a manageable level. But it really is, again, about helping you figure out what helps you stay here and now in a manageable way. And so Sense really offers a lot of physical tools as well as skills to kind of help people choose from and experience and practice with what helps them best in different situations.
And Hugo, on the very practical side, you brought the Tangle to this program. I know it was used at Shepherd Pratt,
Mhm.
initially, where you had done some training, or it also worked. Would you want to comment on just what the Tangle is, so that people who are looking to, find one?
Sure. I'm
Yeah.
finding so if you do a quick image search on Tangle, you'll probably see it, but it's a multi-part device that's each piece is kind of curved like a piece of macaroni, right? A little bit like a U shape, a little bit, not
Mm,
super tight.
yeah.
You can get different textures, different materials. People, again, there too will gravitate to different textures and different materials, uh, and different colors. And what the Tangle does is that each little piece moves, right? So you're kind of just playing with so like a Rubik's Cube is like the closest thing to it if you have used one of that and not a Tangle. Might not be the case. But the difference is with the Tangle, it really can go in almost any direction, right? And you can be wrapping it around your fingers. Um, and especially with the different options of color and texture, and material, right? You can get different temperatures of different materials and you can mix all those up. So people find it's kind of like a multi-purpose grounding helper or sensory tool. Um, and you can just be holding it. You can be kind of playing with it very slowly. You can be moving it quickly. It gives you lots of different options. And so a lot of people do find themselves gravitating to that one. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And it's available
Mhm.
in larger format rather, and
Oh
smaller
yeah.
formats as well. So what's
Mhm.
really nice is you can bring it with you, right? It's portable. It's a portable tool.
Mhm.
And oftentimes I think when people use them, people say like, "What is that? I would like one," right? So
Mhm.
really, a really nice feature of that. And thank you for bringing it to the
Oh,
work.
glad to. Glad
Thank
to. Yeah. Thanks to Shepherd Pratt.
you.
Mhm.
Um, Tammy has a comment for Doctors Lara and Huga. Thank you
Mhm.
for your approach as facilitators and your humor during each of the sessions.
Laughter is a great healing balm for trauma, for sure. Not laughing at, but laughing at the challenges, laughing with the challenges, right? Laughing through them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
We have a question from Vanessa. Are there plans to test in civilian populations? And do you foresee this changing the SENSE program?
An excellent question. And yes, there absolutely are. I think we often want to think about our participants and their experiences. So it's natural and important that people bring their work experiences or their everyday, day-to-day experiences to the group and to discussion. So I think it really helps in creating a sense of not being alone. Oftentimes, people who experienced some of the symptoms of trauma, and give a good example would be, difficulties with memory or attention. They may blame themselves or feel as if, they're the only person experiencing this. But having the opportunity to talk in a group about common experiences, I think is very, very important. So I would contemplate that the group discussions that occur would be somewhat different, though not completely, right? And that's one thing that I think would be a little bit different. But maybe again, Laura, what do you think? Laura, rather, what do you think?
I think she was suggesting you first, Laura.
Sure, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I absolutely think 100% this should be done in civilian populations because, hopefully the goal is that it can be used, in many different treatment settings. And so it's necessary to test it out in civilian populations as well. Yeah, so don't have much more to add, but I just think it's a really good point. Yeah.
Mhm. And maybe just in terms of the discussions, I would just add, because I agree with everything that's been said, that we're also really careful to keep those discussions about the use of the tools and challenges in relation to the use of the tools, right? So as kind of a stabilization focused approach, I see sense as, right? Then what we're trying to do is help people stay in that window of competence, and talking about trauma details or really distressing details can throw people out of that window pretty
Yeah,
easily.
for sure.
So we're aiming as much as possible to talk about, like, how did things go with using the skills, with using the tools? What did you find? What successes did you experience? What challenges did you experience? Anything that you've noticed that you'd like to share with others that might be helpful to others, right? So it can be a kind of a learning community, where we're normalizing that it takes time and practice to learn how to do new things. It's right. We're creating new habits. Habits take time and practice. So very much focused on supporting the work and that stabilization focused of discussion, as opposed to kind of a processing or group process kind of discussion. So I just wanted to highlight the difference. That's part of being trauma informed, right?
Absolutely.
It can feel disappointing to some people sometimes, because the emotion urge to talk about certain things might come up pretty intensely. Very understandable reasons, no shame for that whatsoever. And yet we know that if we were to go down that road, most people will either find that they themselves will get overwhelmed, or that they will overwhelm someone else, which wasn't their intention. And so the best way to approach this really in this kind of setting, like that kind of work can be really powerful individually, but in this kind of setting, to stay really focused on the practice and how that's going and how to refine things and successes and challenges.
Yeah, thank you. And it really speaks to present-centered present-centered therapies for trauma and
Mhm.
past-focused approaches for trauma. And so present-focused therapies tend to focus on the teaching of skills that can be used in everyday life. And so that's been a big part of the approach that we've used in the trauma and recovery research unit is looking at those present-centered skills-based therapeutic approaches.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's like I mentioned, really appropriate for stabilization in particular and creating a
Mhm.
sense of safety.
We have a question from Mike. Having done a few programs and participating in your study, do you see this program in the mainstream therapies? The other programs didn't have sensory objects as part of it, which I did find helpful to some degree and may be helpful for others.
Yeah, I can start off with that. So I do think a kind of strength of sense is that we don't talk about the traumas specifically. And I think that's helpful because everyone's different, right? So some people might be ready and want to talk about their trauma in therapy and be ready for those types of therapies where that's the main part of the treatment. But other people, might not want to go that route or might not be comfortable with that route. And so I think it's important to have options for clients, because right now, most of our frontline treatments for PTSD kind of require that, speaking about the trauma, or at least the effects of the trauma. So I think this can be really great to provide another option for people, if they're not wanting to talk about their trauma or not ready yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, maybe you do a lot of inpatient care. Maybe you could comment from that perspective too, if you don't mind.
To which part
On
specifically?
the inpatient therapies, treatment approaches, if you don't mind, just thinking about the sense within that context.
Yeah, it's really hard to say, because quite frankly, most inpatient places um, are still learning about how to effectively treat trauma.
Yeah.
Um, so I've been fortunate to work in places where a lot of the pieces that are in Sense are part of the program, and an essential part of the program, right? So it's helping people learn how to get and stay in that window, giving lots of education about skills, really emphasizing the importance of practice, encouraging, a fair relationship with yourself as you do that. These are all things that we tried to bring into Sense. Sense, in a way, is kind of what I tried to bring in when I was asked to contribute as well, was the pieces I knew worked well from inpatient into this kind of
Yeah.
outpatient
Yeah.
and remote and potentially asynchronous approach, so that you get kind of the benefit of what we've learned from helping people who are, um, you know, unfortunately have not been able to be helped outside of inpatient settings, as so to what we know can be helpful to those who've perhaps been the most dysregulated, and try to bring that to a more broadly available, broadly accessible, much more affordable um, approach. Yeah.
I did want to say, you remind me of all the many, many people who contributed to SENSE. So I want to really acknowledge them. That includes, of course, Kavita, Lara, Huga, along with Krista Andrews, Shireen Harris Sharon, Mina Pichakova, Christina Chrysler, Kim Ritchie, Linda Tamsito. The list really does go on, and Vanessa Parisi, who's also been involved. I just want to thank everybody because I think that that is one important component of developing new therapeutic approaches is really to consider multiple perspectives. So thinking from the perspective of the person with lived experience, from the psychology lens, nursing, occupational therapy, folks who spend a lot of time in assessment as well. I just really want to thank everyone who was involved for really 2 years of developing this program. It took a lot of time and a lot of thought and a lot of going back and forth and taking it those different sort of clinical and therapeutic lenses that were brought to the table. And I just want to thank all of you so much for all your many, many contributions. I would say this really was a labor of love and time and time. It took time, and that was okay because I think we really want to be thoughtful in the approaches that we use and bring the best of so many different approaches used across different disciplines to the table. So I want to thank all of you for that. And especially to Mina and Kavita and Christina for organizing today's symposium. That was a huge amount of work. And I also want to thank all of you too.
Tammy asks, will a recording of this webinar be sent to the participants of this session? Yes, absolutely. Anybody who registered for this webinar will receive a link to this recording, which will be hosted on our YouTube channel. So please keep an eye out for that email. It should be sent out sometime tomorrow.
If I could just add one thing, I want to also acknowledge Alison Mizzi, who was a graduate student who worked on this project. I would be very remiss not to do so. So I know we're coming to almost the end of our time. I just want to make sure that I do that and thank her as well.
Yeah. We have one last question, and we have only just about 2 minutes left. So Sophie asks, what changes might you make for processing instead of stabilization?
Luca, do you want to address that question?
I mean, I think I would not present myself as a sensory processing expert, so I wouldn't want to mislead there. I tend to use other approaches for processing. It's something I'm looking into. I think it has great power, especially with younger folks. I've seen it be incredibly effective for younger folks, and perhaps people who are less verbally inclined. I could see it being a really good fit there.
Yeah.
I think there's a way where certain approaches that already exist that aren't that specific protocol do include things like completing the action, right? So there's pieces of that in other interventions as well. But yeah, in terms of how, I don't think I would be the one to build out how do we take it from here to being more of a sensory processing approach.
Yeah, and I think we really want to give credit to Liz Warner, who developed the SMART program around sensory-based therapies. Also Pat Ogden and her work as well. I mean, we are learning from others and developing this therapy and really want to give them all credit where credit is due. Absolutely.
And each of them, well, especially Ogden leans on Hakomi quite a bit as well. And so if that's an area of interest, you might find Hakomi worth looking at as well.
Can you describe that, Hugo, just for our audience so they're aware as well?
It's the briefest version of it is experimenting with different actions, different sensations. And this is something that Dr. Ruth Langus is also very much into her work right now as well. So the way she talks about it is what sensation is your body seeking, right? And sort of experimenting with that, noticing what works for you essentially. And so there's a way in which a lot of this started with Hakomi way back when.
Yeah.
And then I went into Dr. Ogden's work and now into all these many other areas as well. But yeah.
Well, I know we're at 11:30. I just want to end on a note of thanks to everyone here, the audience, to our participants who have joined us today. Thank you so much to, those who have facilitated these seminars and helped develop them, including Laura, Kavita, and Huga. Thank you so much for your many contributions. And just thank you to Veterans Affairs Canada, who made this work possible. They've been a wonderful partner to us in the Trauma and Recovery Research Unit, and we just want to acknowledge and thank them for all of their contributions in the Veterans Wellbeing Fund, which allowed us to develop this treatment approach and test it. So thank you to everyone. I want to also apologize, as I always do, to my colleagues that I have to run to another meeting now, so I won't be available to debrief. I just wanted to say that. So I apologize. And thank you to everyone who attended. Again, we're very, very grateful for your participation.
Thank you so much, everybody. This was so great. It was so good to see so many people attend. And if you have any feedback, any questions, please, of course, feel free to reach out to us using our feedback form that was posted earlier, or even just emailing us. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
All the best, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care all.